Hey everybody, it's JP here. I am just going to go through the webinar for the 5th week of the Full Stack Nano degree. The way I'm going to go through it hopefully will be useful to you, not by repeating the content from the lessons, but perhaps showing you how to actually go about building something. So basically, I'll start by building on what we did last week, which was SQL. So I'll start with the entity relationship diagram. What I'll do is just have an actual, an example of something we could build, something relatable, but something we can do quickly in this webinar. And then go from the beginning to right to the end, and hopefully we can start the server and at least take a look at what it looks like. So what I was thinking of doing is building a Twitter application, obviously far more simplified, but essentially if it's something that should be quite easy to model and something quite intuitive for everyone to wrap their heads around and then to go ahead and build. So essentially with Twitter, we'd go, let me actually just bring up the entity relationship diagram that I drew. So if we take a look here, if you think of Twitter, right, you essentially have two objects. You have tweets and you have tweeters, the people that make the tweets, so users. So we're going to go from this, see how to model it, and then we're going to take a look at SQ Alchemy, explain exactly what it is in different words to how it's explained, just so you have a different way of or someone else explaining it, and then we'll see how that is SQ Alchemy is used in Flask. We'll talk about how you could go about doing this exact same thing without using SQ Alchemy, and then you'll see how much better it is. And then go through the CRUD functionality. Like I've got the code and we'll just walk through it. And yeah, hopefully you'll see how to go from a concept, an idea, to an application that's working with Flask. And hopefully we'll just be able to touch on all the main points. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, just type them in the I don't know what you call it, in the chat area of this Hangout. Cool. So essentially, the best way to go about this is to build your entity relationship diagram, so you can model the data exactly how, or you can build your application understanding exactly how all of the data relates to each other. So essentially, obviously this is very simplified and there's a lot more information about tweets and users that would be relevant in the real Twitter, but yeah, sorry, I won't say that again. I'm just highlighting that this is a bit simplified. So, but hopefully we have the main information. So you have a user, and the user will be identified, will have a unique identifier. So, and that will be an integer, but that'll be assigned by the program itself. Then you'll have a username, so your Twitter handle, and that'll be a string or character depending on what backend you're using. For this, we'll just use SQLite. It's built in to Python. And then I'll get back to this foreign key, but then you have a tweet, and a tweet will have each tweet has its own ID or primary key. And then, apologies, that doesn't need to be there. And neither does this. Sorry about that. You could put something else here. In fact, I will. Don't think I put it in the database, but so basically you'd want, I guess, a date time object, something like that. But basically, so if you think about a tweet, right, it's got various attributes, but the most important ones would be the content of the tweet. So that's this. This is the actual tweet content, okay, which would be a string. And then perhaps a date time, a timestamp, so you know when it was tweeted. And then obviously you want to know who tweeted. So that's what this relationship is indicating, right? That every tweet has to be tweeted by a user. And so this essentially is enough for you to, build an application that lists a bunch of either lists a bunch of users as one of the views or a bunch of tweets as one of the views. And you could go in between them, so you could click on a user and see all the tweets they made. If you put the correct rules in place, you could say that if you are the user that's logged in, then you could make a tweet, you could edit a tweet, and you could delete a tweet. I don't think Twitter actually allows you to edit tweets, but yeah, for all intents and purposes, that's what you can do. So this is all the information you really need to start modeling this application. So maybe I'll just elaborate on the cardinality here. I don't know if you guys remember from last week, but basically the cardinality is just a way of describing the relationship between the different entities, as the name says, I guess, ERD. And the way that you do it is you'll see that you have, sorry, I don't think I can fit them both in here. So we'll just have to make it a bit smaller here and hide that. Sorry. So the way that that you use the cardinality to describe the relationship is you say, you look and you'll see that on each line, right, you will have two symbols, right? And the inner one would be the minimum and the outer is the maximum. So in this case, if you wanted to determine what two symbols to put here, right, you would say, what is the minimum number of tweets that a user can have? And so if you think about it, how many tweets is the minimum number that a user could have? And so obviously if you set up a Twitter account and then a tweet, right, then you're still allowed to exist. So the minimum number is 0. And what is the maximum amount of tweets that a user can have? And that's infinite. So we use this symbol over here, 0 or many. Then we move to this side and we look over here and we say, what is the minimum number of users that a tweet can have, right? And obviously every tweet can only be written by one person. Cause a huge amount of confusion if the same tweet was, created by several people. So obviously there's a 1. And then what is the maximum amount of users that a tweet can have? And it's exactly the same, 1. So it's not just a 1 that we use, like over here. It's 1 and only 1. There can always only be one user responsible for each tweet. So yeah, I don't want to dwell too much on this. I just wanted to recap this from when we last spoke about it. Sorry, I'm just checking if there's any questions here. No, okay. So from here, right, you can use this and you can start to build your database, right? You can start, like we spoke about, SQL, um, creating a database and then creating tables. So you might have create a database called Twitter, and then you might, create a table called user, and you might um, add these uh, uh, columns to the table, and assign them as, with these relationships. But we are going to use SQ Alchemy, which hopefully you've gone through the content on SQ Alchemy. And so the reason that we do that is, if you think about it, when you're writing a Python application, right? If you were using your Python application to talk directly with a database, you would be writing, essentially your Python files would have um, both Python and SQL, and that can become quite cumbersome. Just makes it a bit less secure with SQL injection attacks, and um, it's just a cumbersome way to write your application. So um, some clever people developed these tools called object relational mappers. And what an object relational mapper does is it turns your it relates your code that you can write. Basically, you can turn this SQL data or your database data into Python objects, um, and let the object relational mapper write the actual SQL statements. So I'll show you what that means. I was just trying to explain it quickly in a couple of, in layman's terms. But I'm sure you guys have already gone through it. But let's just go to the SQL Alchemy website and see exactly what they say. It's an amazing website. It's pretty mundane, but it's really logical what they talk about. So as you can see, I'll just read the first line. SQL Alchemy is the Python SQL toolkit and object relational mapper that gives application developers the full power and flexibility of SQL. So yeah, basically you just write Python code and it talks to your database. So yeah, with that being said, we will start by what I'm going to do now is just walk you through the code for this basic application that we were looking at. Okay, so essentially you're going to have 4 pieces of code that you want to write, or 4, there's 4 main parts, right? Or actually, let me say there's 5. So essentially you're going to have, the code that sets up the SQL Alchemy and builds a database and links your Python code to the database via SQL Alchemy. So you set that up. And I think that they used in the course notes, they use the incredibly intuitive name database setup.py. So I've done exactly the same. And then obviously, instead of you just sitting and manually entering a whole bunch of stuff, there's a database population file, but that just talks to SQL Alchemy and puts in a bunch of dummy data. And then there's your main Python, your main application, your Flask application. So just call it main.py. Sorry, I can't count. Not 5. There's 4 main parts, and then obviously you need a front end. So some templates, some HTML that you can actually with forms, and so you can actually view your tweets, view your users, and then implement your CRUD functionality that's written in your main file. So that would be a collection of HTML files, and then obviously some styling, and if you want a bit of JavaScript to manipulate the DOM. But essentially, I'm just going to show you the database setup, the database population we'll just take a quick glance at, and then your main Python file. So if I bring this over here, you should have seen this already in the course, that goes through it. But essentially, right, what we have to do is create a database, or allow SQL Alchemy to create a database. Right? Then we create two classes, right? And every single class that represents a database table will inherit from this declarative base class, which is, I guess, the foundation of SQL Alchemy's object relational mapper. So this is the code. As you can see here, we have our two classes, the user and tweets. So I just wrote this quickly, and the main thing should relate. I think I said this was UID in the picture I showed you here, UID. So apologies, these aren't identical, but essentially, hopefully, they're intuitive to you. So you have the unique identifier, right? So that's just the primary key, as it says here. You have your name of your user, and then this is how you describe the relationship, right? So I won't go into this, but there's obviously a bunch of different relationships, as the cardinality that we just touched on implies between different elements. So depending on if it's a many-to-many or a one-to-many or a many-to-one relationship, essentially you just go to SQL Alchemy, and I don't actually know where to find it. Sorry, this is a good exercise. Sorry for me to just quickly do this live. So sorry, object relational tutorial, and then maybe we'd say one to many, I guess. Basic relationship patterns. There we go. And here you would see exactly how to build in the different types of relationships. So sorry, I'm just trying to drill this in so that it's second nature. But essentially, you figure out what the relationship is between your data that makes the most sense. I think the one that we've chosen here is quite intuitive, that a user can have 0 or many tweets, and a tweet can only have one and only one users. So basically, you put that in, and then you would go to the SQL Alchemy documentation. You can see it's exactly the same. They've got a class for each of their database tables. And then you would see exactly how you relate the two, either just a simple foreign key, right, and a relationship, or this back population, or many to one. Yeah, sorry, I won't go into this and just read it, and you can read it yourself. But essentially, all that happens is you change some of the arguments in this relationship. That's what happens. So it's pretty intuitive. So here we go. That's all we did here. So this tweet here shows the relationship between this tweet class over here and that they back populate each other. This is just so that if you make changes in one of your tables, so for example, if you delete a user, then you obviously can't access all the user's tweets, in the application itself, for example. So so the very first part is deciding on the architecture, drawing out the entity relationship diagram, And then instead of going to the, building your actual database in SQL, you create objects using SQL Alchemy, and that's how you set up your database. It's database setup. So this would create give SQL Alchemy everything that it needs to be able to write to the database. So were you to run this, right, you will actually see a database set up. So I can't actually prove it to you, but you might have to believe me, but I'll try and show you. So if we went to, so here's the basically where I've got it sitting, the database setup, these three files that you see. And if I were to run this, okay, then you will see there's no actual database here. But once I run this database setup.py file, this a database will be created, and the database will be called whatever we called it here. Twitty, sorry, I don't know, I just call it Twitter. It's trying to be funny, I guess. Weird. This database will be created when you run this Python file. And if that's the case, then you know that everything worked out. So maybe one other thing I should mention, I didn't want to go into this because we'll all have different development environments, and that's a whole big thing on its own. But essentially here I've got git bash open, and let me just see. Yeah, so I created a virtual environment. This is done differently, so I won't really go into it. But basically, that just allows you to, I think, basically what the excuse that everyone used to give was it worked on my machine. So essentially, a virtual environment is just where, I'm sure you all know this, so sorry if I'm repeating, but a virtual environment is just a place where you can install all of the dependencies required for whatever application you're building, and you can, I think you would print out a requirements file that somebody else that wanted to run your application in the exact same way could then install on their own virtual environment. So essentially, I've got a virtual environment running. I've installed all the dependencies, but literally that's just like pip install Flask, pip install SQL Alchemy, and I think that's about it. So once you've got that, you'd end up here, you'd have the different files. So I haven't gone into the database setup or the most important one, which is the main file. I just wanted to show you if I type Python database setup, you should see over here, you should see that Twitty database over here appear. So if I run this code, hopefully it'll work. Yeah, then now it's just written build the database. Forget this. This is just some other software I have on my computer, sorry. But yeah, that's your database, your SQLite database. So I'll just delete it for now. But yeah, hopefully you understand the database setup.file. I won't really go into this, but all you're doing is now connecting to your engine, which is the database via SQL Alchemy, right? And then you maybe this is the best time, sorry, to just say once you do this, then you can start with your CRUD actions. So if you were writing SQL, raw SQL, you'd have like insert into, and that would be like, insert into table values. And sorry, I hope I'm making sense here, but essentially, I think it's a W3 schools insert into. So I don't know why I did that. Sorry. W3 schools insert into. So essentially, you'd be writing SQL like this. You'd have a Python. If you just had this, if you didn't use SQL Alchemy, you'd connect. You'd have a cursor. You'd connect. I can't remember exactly, but you'd create a cursor, and then from there, inside there, you would say, cursor once you've connected to your database, and then you would execute SQL into users values, and something like this is how you would do it, and it would become incredibly tedious. And that would be your CRUD functionality. Insert into would be your create. Select would be your read. Then you have update. I mean, it doesn't map perfectly. You've got upsert. You've got a whole bunch of different SQL queries. But essentially, the way that the CRUD functionality works when you use SQL Alchemy is that they've got a whole range of different keywords. So what you do is you connect to the database, you create a session, right? And the important thing is whenever you create some command, right, you need to commit at the end for it to persist. So essentially, if you want to create a C in CRUD, right, you use add. Okay, so this should be quite clear what's going on. We're defining 2 users, we're defining 6 tweets, right? We're adding them all and then we're committing. So if this was run and we had set up a database, so there was an actual database for that could be populated, then this would all be inside the application. So I'll show you that now, but let me first just quickly get to your actual main application. So now you know how to set up the database once you've once you've created it, thought of what you want to build, you understand the relationships, you can set up the database so it's able to populate. Then you populate it with some dummy data. And then you want your main application. Okay, so this is Flask. So obviously you have SQL Alchemy because you need to connect to the backend that you've just created. So that's all that this is doing. You'll see that this should be identical to this over here. Right, so it's just connecting to the database and creating a session. Okay. And then the most important things about Flask, I'm sure you've done the course already, but the Udacity course is on it. But you have these decorators that route to different endpoints. Okay. And so if you want to do different things, that's the most important thing, I think, that I want to still get across is the way that your CRUD functionality works. So we saw that the C for create is done with session.add. So the add is the keyword. Okay, so that's how you read with add. Then, so that's how you create. Apology, sorry, that's how you create. Then for read from CRUD, right, you use query. Okay, so read and query. Okay. So for example, if you look here, if you go to the home page, which can be one of these two, right? We are just rendering a template, right? And it should just list all of the users. So if we had just populated our database with user 1 and 2, and you go to the home page, this is all you'd have to write to have a working application, right? And it would just render all of the users. So it queries, it uses the session queries user, which is what we called our our user over here, our user class, and we want to return all. You can do a whole bunch of things like first, or with an ID equal to, this query parameters in the same way that you do select statements. So, but we just want all of them for now. So one other thing I should quickly just go into is interacting with this. So if you go back to object relational tutorial, once you've done all the mapping, right, when you've created a session, right, which is what we've done. I'm sure you recognize this from the code I just showed you, right? So add we already did, right? I just want to show you. Query is exactly like reading into the database, and there's obviously a whole bunch of different ways to query, right? So we just used all in the example I just showed you, okay? But you can do very detailed queries. So for example here, order bar, okay? So the ID of the user, and you want the first two, 1 and 2, sorry. And so all you do is you go to SQL Alchemy and you look if you want a more advanced query. It's got all of the details here of how to do that, right? So that's how you read or query your database, okay? Update would be querying and then changing and then adding again and committing, right? And so just another thing to keep in mind, you only commit, right, if you've made a change, right? So let's go. So this is just a home page, right? And it will query your database and it'll bring you all of your users. Okay. So then if we look at this page here, right, it'll have get and post requests. Basically, you would this is just going into the HTML form, right? And it's grabbing the username. So if you had a form and you typed, if there was a page and it said create new user, this is just the code, which is a very small amount of code, which is why Flask is so cool. That allows you to grab all the data from that form, right? You create a user, you add the user. That's it. That's simply how you write it into the. Instead of saying insert into, if you're and actually having SQL code here, that's what you do, and then you commit. So every time, if you're just querying the database, like over here, you obviously don't commit. But when you change things, you commit. So here's how we add a new user. And this is how we edit a user. Okay. You go and grab, you essentially you would have the same form, and the person interacting with your HTML form would put the new name, right, the edited name or whatever into the field, and you would do the exact same thing. So you add it and you commit, and this is just for redirecting back to where you are. That's more going into the different patterns of Flask, not the actual CRUD functionality. But it's not complex at all. The course explains it quite well, the Udacity course. Okay, and then the last thing will be delete. And as you can see, delete is super, super intuitive. All you do is delete. That's the keyword. And then commit. So just so I won't go into it in detail, but just so you understand, there's nothing here in this code that is not complicated or that I'm ignoring or not going into. If I'm not going into it, it's because I don't want to waste your time. But I promise you, there's nothing that's complicated. The only things you really need to understand is that you create fundamentally need to understand, and then you just do this a few times until it becomes second nature. But you create your database objects. So these are tables, right? You turn them into objects with attributes following the exact templating or the exact way that it explains on the SQL Alchemy's documentation. But it's super, super intuitive if you think about it. Right? Your class is your table name, and each of your columns is an attribute in your class. Cool. Then you populate, and then once you understand the basics of Flask, right? And these decorators, the decorators just essentially a function with additional functionality. Yeah, I think if you go to Corey Schaefer, he's got a great Corey Schaefer's YouTube channel. It's the reference they use in the Udacity course, explaining the decorators. I didn't think it was. I mean, it makes a bit of sense, but to me, Corey Schaefer explains it a lot better. Sorry, I hope I'm making sense to you, but Corey Schaefer YouTube decorators. But essentially, it's just so this is what I would go and take a look at if you're a bit confused on decorators. He explains it perfectly, exactly how to use them and why they're used. So yeah, Flask uses decorators for your routing. Your routing just being, where in the application the user is, depending on what they want to do, and it's super intuitive. So this is the index, your home page. This is your, where you add a user, and that's exactly what we did. We grabbed data from a form, and we persisted to our database via SQL Alchemy. I just wanted to show you one last thing. Sorry, let me just quickly, before wrapping up, I don't want to waste too much of your time. I just want to show you that there's nothing too complicated. So what you do is you do the imports for what you'll be using. You can see here's where we did the database setup. So obviously you want the base class, SQL Alchemy's base class, and then the two classes that we created, the user and the tweet. Then you want to connect to this engine, which is the way that SQL Alchemy creates the database. And then you want to create a session. The session is where you would interact. You do the exact same thing. If you were just using Python. I'll actually just Google it quickly, just to show you. It's super easy. Python DB API for SQLite. I think that's the code. So you just create a connection, right? Then you create a cursor, like I was showing you earlier, and then you use your cursor to execute, and that's where you write your insert into the table called stocks, and these are the values: a date, what you do, who did it, and an amount, and a quantity and a price. Well, there they are, sorry. Exactly the date, the transaction text, symbol text, quality, and the quantity and the price. So instead of doing all of this, right, and having to write SQL the whole time, what you do is you create the session with SQL Alchemy, and you do your queries, your adds, and your deletes. Your add being used for both update and add. So the last thing is just to show you that there's nothing more to this application. This is how you start any Flask application. Sorry, that's just page 1 of the docs. Flask. See, this is exactly the same. App equals Flask name. That's all we've got here. I agree with him. Flask is fun. home, add user, edit user. So you would go and look up, you query your you query your database using SQL commute and those different commands that I showed you, and use filter bar. See, you don't say all, you say one, and yeah, you edit it if you want. Then delete. We also went into that. Then tweets would show you all the tweets by a certain user. Then add tweets would be where you add. So here all we did was we added a different user. Now you've got the exact same functionality, but it's for tweets. So tweeting, adding a tweet, edit a tweet, delete a tweet, and that's literally all there is, right? To this application. So yeah, hopefully given you an overview of. Sorry, it's not my normal editor. It's just a bit harder to read in here. I haven't set up VS Code or PyCharm to look, yeah, so that it's easy for you guys to read on the webinar. So yeah, this is what you do. Create a virtual environment. You set up your database. I might have to debug a bit, but I've already gone on so long, so hopefully I've just shown you. But we will try. Let me just show you. This is the last thing, sorry, and then I'll end this webinar. Sorry, guys. But so we have our three main bits of Python code. So we set up our database, we populate our database, and obviously you need to do this before you start running your application because you have to run your database setup before you can populate the database or interact with the database. Because obviously, there's no database, there's nothing you can do. And then over here, the last thing to show you is that in the main application, using templates, right? Just to show the, this is just your HTML, this is the forms and your user interface. So that's the only other code you'd need. So you have your templates here, add user. I won't go into this, don't worry. But this is just HTML. Maybe I'll just show you the main page. Open with Sublime Text, and you can just see it's an HTML page, and it's just using templating language to, list all of the users. And that's all there is. And every single other page in here is like that. It's just some of the functionality that we saw in this Flask application here. And I think that's it. Yeah, and then there's a little bit of styling. So that's a full application. If you guys want, I can just send you this code. There's obviously better examples. I just wrote it all up. Let's just see if it does work. So if we set up the database, no, it's not working. Sorry. Well, I'm not going to debug this live. I'll just see if it's something I can. Something stupid, probably line 33. Database setup.py, I did something. I don't think I did anything. Sorry, if I don't fix this right now, I'll leave it at that. Sorry. Let me just. Oh, I have a database already. So if I go here and I say table user has no column ID. Oh, so I messed this up. I think that's what I did. Sorry, I just took out that U there when I was showing you the different names. So let's just see. Database setup. Oh no, so obviously I have to go into this, what I call these tables. Yeah, I've made a mistake somewhere. So it probably won't work if I try and run it. But anyways, population. So obviously, sorry, I'm doing something stupid here. I've got this user ID and I've changed the name somewhere, which has messed things up. So yeah, sorry, I'm just going to leave it there. Hopefully, I've been able to show you exactly how to go about, you know, creating an application and how to implement your CRUD functionality. Yeah, and if anybody has any questions, just let me know. Just ask on the Slack channel, or obviously I think this goes to YouTube, so you can ask questions there. I'm just checking. Yeah, there's no questions right now. So yeah, I hope it was useful, guys. Yeah, and have a good weekend. Cheers.